I've waffled a little bit on what to title this because a seminar is a moving target. And as we recall from this quote that keeps reappearing from Tschumi, occasionally jumps happen because the continuation between a design intention and the available technology. And it's been sort of an underlying theme, I think, that we've seen throughout the presentations we've had this week, throughout the discussions we've had, and in the exhibition Archaeology of the Digital itself. Just recapping quickly, we've had people like Peter Testa here to talk about robots in the black box. He was at MIT, is now at SciArc. We've had, of course, Tschumi, who I think pushed us a little bit to think about what's happening with architecture and representation. We had the questions of representation, and we haven't found ourselves on quite steady footing this week, what it means to represent when we're dealing with the digital mode. We do, of course, have Lynn here in 3D glasses, but in 3 dimensions when we had him here for the first week of the seminar. And we've had what he admits is a personal archaeology of the digital. And one of the things that I'll talk about today, or the general theme I'll address today, is other archaeologies of other digitals. We have Antoine Picon, of course. I probably don't need to say much more about him given the conversations we've had last night and this morning, but I think he's been excellent in framing the bigger issues that we are dealing with. Reinhold brought up visualization as opposed to representation as a potential strategy for dealing with information in the digital. Hani Rashid, who is apparently missing a D in his name, excuse me. I'll put it back in, he gets a D for digital. He brought in, one of the things that I keep coming back to is the time and the information landscapes that he presented in things like the New York Stock Exchange. Stan Allen talked a little bit about another kind of framing, a tiering of time and eras in digital architecture, and we brought back the questions of diagramming and notation. Oosterhuis, who challenged us a little bit on challenged us in multiple ways on some ideas about architecture, physical, digital architecture, and perspectives on it. So a wide-ranging week that leaves us, I think, with maybe more points to question and more points of departure. I want to point out that there are one thing that's come up too is a little bit about genealogies. A couple of things I just wanted to put into the mix. Things like the Architecture and the Computer Show in 1964 at the Boston Architectural Center. Walter Gropius made the opening remarks, which were read, not actually presented. He was quite old at that point. Christopher Alexander presented. Marvin Minsky, the artificial intelligence pioneer, was there. Stephen Coons, pioneer of computer-aided design. A lot of very important people trying to put together what the effects of computation would be on architecture at that early point. And then 1968, computer graphics in architecture and design at Yale, another important conference with some of these figures and newer figures looking at the importance for computers on architecture and design. So these are earlier computers than we've been talking about, but certainly important predecessors. Oops, that went fast. The 1966 Design Quarterly, double issue that the Walker Arts Center put out. And in here, there are people like, again, Stephen Coons, Christopher Alexander, Marvin Mannheim, Edwin Jacks, Alan Bernholtz, and Kenneth Scheid talking about different aspects of computing and architecture. And then finally, another early data visualization. This is Boeing Man. This is from William Fetter, who worked at Boeing and brought computer graphics and the human form together to visualize cockpits and the human figure in cooperation with one another. So just a couple things to put out there. But today what I'd like to talk about is the role of information and a different use of information, not so much for representation, which is, as said, a pretty loaded term, but or not as digital as a medium, as Lynn termed it, but information as the structural mode and the technology used for architecture. We keep having this specter of IBM. I keep hearing it here and there, and Peter McCullough, who was the CEO, or excuse me, the president of IBM in 1970, stated this: "What we seek is to think of information itself as a natural and undeveloped environment which can be enclosed and made more habitable for the people who live and work within it." I have just made a terrible mistake. He's not at IBM, he's at Xerox. And it was in this particular talk that he announced the founding of Xerox PARC, the research center. So what does it mean when we're talking about information being inhabitable? Or what does it mean when we're talking about control over information? I think one thing we see is that it is explicitly an architectural problem, and it has important connections with where we are today. Of course, we started with these two quotes when we began our seminar on Monday a week ago. Our writing tools are also working on our thoughts, which is Kittler quoting Nietzsche, and Cornelia Visman talking about the information, formatting the information. So what are we doing here when we're talking about information architecture and the ways they cross over? On one hand, we're looking at issues of formatting. I think, to use Reinhold's term, visualizing, generating, mediating, and spatializing data. And so these are all different formats and different modes that provide other archaeologies of the digital that are within architecture. So I'm going to present the work of three architects today. I'm going to present a trajectory of Christopher Alexander, who seems to come up every day and is a problematic figure in a lot of ways, but I think an important one. Cedric Price, the archive of which is here and which I've been lucky enough to have several visits to. And then finally, Nicholas Negroponte and the Architecture Machine Group. And as I examine these things and show you various studies, we'll see the ways that architecture is formatting information, or that information is used to format architecture, the ways that visualization structures the possibilities, the ways that they're used to generate solutions that are beyond what the architects or the users might expect, rather than being explicit control, and architecture being mediating and eventually giving rise to media as a term, as a, again, loaded term, and then finally the spatialization of data being something that is used to surround a user or to as a mode for looking at information. So Christopher Alexander is, of course, best known for, I think, these two books, although there are many others. Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which is the published version of his 1961 dissertation. It was published in 1964, and A Pattern Language was published in 1979. Christopher Alexander studied math at Cambridge, then he came to Harvard for a PhD, and his dissertation committee reflected a pretty broad group of people. It included Jerome Bruner, who was a cognitive psychology luminary, Serge Chermayeff, who's the architect and industrial designer, and Arthur Moss, who's a political scientist. So what he was interested in doing is representing form through information and through structure. He made them equivalent to one another. He structured these things visually using a tree, using what he called a semi-lattice, and then eventually using a network. He's completely circumscribed by what is possible in those visualizations, as we'll see. And he's also a pretty frustrating person to research because his rhetoric is really, really difficult. It is quite painful. It should be noted also that he has a famous relationship with, or a famous connection to Peter Eisenman, who had a pretty similar background. They had a very famous debate in 1982 at Berkeley, in which I think you could say that Peter Eisenman pretty much tore him to shreds. But still very interesting to look at these lineages, and I would point you to Sean Keller's dissertation and articles on it. So the idea here in Notes on the Synthesis of Form is that form is a matter of finding misfits, of alleviating misfits. You can figure out what's wrong by you list out what's wrong, and then you group it together, and you find where the relative density is. You structure it as a tree, and you use a computer to calculate those densities, right? What he has then is a program consisting of sets, and then he has diagrams going back up, or things that break down into a set of requirements: production, safety, use, capital maintenance. These are all the things that might go together into a tea kettle. Once you could structure a design problem in that way, you could make it hyper-stable, he thought. And he called this ultra stability, a notion he took from W. Ross Ashby, a cyberneticist. Ashby modeled this with this thing you see here. It's a homeostat. It's a computer that used water and electricity and magnets, and it would knock itself back into a stable state. So this is one of the things he modeled. The other thing he was very inspired by was Darcy Wentworth Thompson, another person that we keep talking about. Antoine mentioned him yesterday. Greg was talking about his statement again that it's a diagram of forces. These are the way that Alexander models those forces, only he models it as trees in this case. So this is prior to his dissertation, the publication of his dissertation. He worked on a set of projects on civil engineering for highways. And the reason to do this was an opportunity to get him into the computer that the civil engineering building had. And so working with Marvin Mannheim, he structured these problems so that they could be solved by, he structured his first problems for civil engineering and not the Indian villages. In fact, I'm going to move ahead to how he did this. And they're a strange set of diagrams. So when we see Alexander, we see these diagrams that don't make a lot of sense in Notes on the Synthesis of Form. They're kind of evoking the forces. The actual genesis is from these descriptions of conditions when you're designing highway exchanges. Here's all of them. Things like they would broadcast, or they'd project a map. They'd figure out where the services were. They would basically cluster accordingly and then make drawings that were meant to evoke it. They'd then put these drawings in trees, and these would evoke the conditions that they meant to use. So on one hand, they'd use computers for reasons that computers didn't really need to be used, and another, they'd use these trees of diagrams to show the forces. Later, this is what we see reflected in something like Notes on the Synthesis of Form, when we see the diagrams showing the Indian village. But again, in each of these conditions, it's always a tree. It's top down, and the only way, if you look at, this is a little difficult to see, but it's one of the printouts. It's quite a long gatefold of all of the different diagrams in one of these highway design problems. And so if you can group it in these ways, you could then make the best decision as a designer for what to do. He also applies this to the BART system in San Francisco in 1964. He came up with, along with his collaborators, King and Ishikawa, he came up with over 300 different requirements that would need to be used for the design of a mass transit system. But then this didn't mesh well with how the engineering culture at BART worked, or with the San Francisco city government, and so the project didn't continue. Again, too much top-down, too much computation where it wasn't required. Again, he will take a tree and fit problems into a tree when that's all he has, but then when he has the ability eventually to calculate multiple relationships in the set theory and the graph theory calculations he's making, a semi-lattice becomes possible. And his rhetoric, again, is kind of ridiculous. When in something like The City is Not a Tree, when he's discovered the semi-lattice, he writes, "The city is not, cannot, and must not be a tree," now that he's got a method that is more complex. "The city is a receptacle for life. If the receptacle severs the overlap of the strands of life within it, because it is a tree, it will be like a bowl full of razor blades on edge, ready to cut up whatever is entrusted to it. In such a receptacle, life will be cut to pieces. If we make cities which are trees, they will cut our life within to pieces." So this is how strong the visual structures are that organize and format his information. And with this, in A City is Not a Tree, he talks about, he takes a look at all existing cities and determines that Kenzo Tange's New Tokyo plan is a tree, and that Chandigarh is a tree, and that maybe an open society, the model of an open society, which is what you see down here, is a semi-lattice. But he writes that, you are no doubt wondering by now what a city looks like, which is a semi-lattice but not a tree. I must confess, I cannot yet show you plans or sketches. And he goes on to explain that the ideal isn't there, but eventually someday the thinking will catch up. Eventually, from about 1968 till 1977, he starts working on the pattern language, and he comes up with a format for defining a design problem as a network and a set of formats that link together. We've seen this image show up in a couple of different presentations. This is Paul Barron's network diagram from 1962, showing centralized, decentralized, and distributed networks. Distributed networks are redundant. They have multiple nodes of connection. And in a national defense situation are a safer model. So Alexander starts in, this is in Timeless Way of Building, starts defining the relation of all of these different patterns, these ways of solving design problems as a network. And these networks between patterns, creates the language that he has in mind. And as he's moved away from physical modes of representation, from the tree to the semi-lattice to the network, by the time he gets to the network, things are open-ended, he doesn't use a computer, and he doesn't need to force things backward into kind of a linear and pretty outmoded notion. So again, the patterns, and I would assume most people here are familiar with the pattern language book, or have at least seen them. Each pattern has an image, a problem statement, a diagram that solves the statement, a pattern that addresses the problem to be solved, and its relationship to the rest of the network of patterns. So again, the way that a user is to use them is to take a mental image of something they might want to build, create a pattern, and then make form, and then reiterate back through that. So again, it's the application, it's a formatting language for architecture that looks quite a bit different than the kind of procedures that somebody like Peter Eisenman might use, or the kinds of representations that result when people are working with computer-aided design. It's still very computational, and it still has the logics of information and formatting within it, and it's structured by visual information structures. So moving on to Cedric Price, one of the things that I'm interested in his work is how he represents information and how he uses architecture as a way to grapple with information networks and with communication possibilities and with information. Very quickly, the Oxford Corner House project that he started in 1966 was a feasibility study for Lyons Corner House, for a restaurant chain that at one point had been thriving but had fallen into harder times. One of the things about the company that started it, J. Lyons Limited, is that they also created the first business computer in Great Britain, the Leo, in 1953. So they used it to manage payroll and inventory. So it wouldn't be too great a jump that the Oxford Corner House might be re-envisioned as an information hub. And that's what he basically envisioned. So while sketches began to look like this, and maybe there would be a planetarium, I think that what gives you a better idea is when I start showing you how he procedurally worked through it. He includes in his archive a number of articles, including network diagrams, like this one about an information utility. So there's a user, a keyboard terminal, and then a conversational machine, and then this square right here announces immense national batch processor serving all regions. So a huge amount of network space has been conflated in this diagram. And he includes other things about the future of libraries in the folio and in the study, and in access to computing power, how he projected it in 1996. And then they start working through how a bunch of different learning and social activities could be distributed throughout this space and how they would be served. There are these network diagrams, again, where information comes in transmitted into teleprinters. At this point in time, computer monitors in the way that we display information would not have been possible, and so instead what he proposed was using a number of teleprinters with cameras and screens all around. Pardon? This is someone working with Cedric in his office, yes. So not his hand, his collaborator, and I can follow up on his name. But basically it runs all the way up and then it's distributed through the building. This happens for a bunch of different kinds of information. So he's thinking about information flows and explicitly placing them throughout the entire place. Here's what it begins to look like. These are all teleprinters. I think I've counted more than 30 of them. These are all cameras. These are, you'll see screens in just a moment in one of the next drawings. But it's a massive, massive information undertaking. He spec'd out an 844,000 pound computer run by IBM, and I think there would have been 20 to 50 computer operators located in the basement who could pull up information for a user at a given moment. They studied they studied screen placement for maximum information use. So again, the information flows are structuring what happens here in architectural space. Smaller screens, more users, but these are done in a set of, it really does kind of remind me almost of an animated GIF, that it's a set of procedures that read on top of each other. He also believed that the floors should move, so he investigated what it would take. I think they were elevators that would move swimming pools. And they'd create modular spaces depending on the uses and the requirements. Another thing that Cedric Price did was use information charting techniques and methods across the board as a way of parsing information. So in a number of projects you see things like this network chart. The ones for Generator and I think Fun Palace are probably a little better known. But this is Oxford Corner House, so you see factors requiring physical definition and total design elements of OCH feasibility study, and factors determined by supposition. And each of these go with a probability chart showing the likelihood, not just of completion, but of the knowledge that might be gained. There's something very playful about them and yet very serious at the same time. They seem to map to things like critical path management and PERT management and other 50s era project management tools. This is actually from Price's copy of Network Planning for Building Construction and shows sort of the way that this kind of model can work, showing what the contingencies are, the critical path for completion of the project. Price also was a great categorizer of everything. So taxonomizing the world was a way of understanding architecture within it. In an information storage project he did, everything has a specific number. So the first number here is general classification, the second is the type of process. But these things that he puts in, it's not just car parking or air pollution. It's not architectural. It's not traditionally architectural, I want to say. You see computer environment here. You see plastic cups. And they worked through an entire kind of ontology of the world in this process. And they spec'd out the possibilities, again, of using a big computer system, of turning it out to the world at large and providing information. They signed up with the National Library Board. But ultimately, what they went for was just these cards, these punch cards, and this is the Cope Chat system, a particularly British one. So you see here the different models, the different numbers, the different categories. And the way that this works is you stick a needle through all of the cards, and the appropriate ones that you're seeking fall out. So if you're trying to reach 127, or if you're looking for trends in underground ground level concentration of smoke or whatever it is, that would help you to find anything that's done like this. EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, at this time also used something like this for the artist matching system. So very inexpensive, but still something kind of vital for his process. We've talked briefly about Generator. Antoine touched on it yesterday and mentioned that it was, I forget what your exact words were, but It's a visualization of a different set of approaches. So this is 1976 to 1979. And what he's starting to show here is the possibilities of distributed computing and distributed interaction and playfulness and, again, the kind of continual return to indeterminacy that you see in his work. In defining it, one of the statements he makes about this, and this is from an interview with Hans-Ulrich Obrist in 2003, he says that in defining architecture, you don't necessarily define the consumption of it. So in creating Generator, which should probably jump ahead just a little bit, it's one of these projects, like all of his projects, there's often no building, so there's no easy endpoint and no easy endpoint. It's like trying to understand a computer game experience. You need to look at the sum of it in order to completely understand it. But it's a reconfigurable, a responsive architectural project for the White Oak Plantation in Georgia, on the Georgia-Florida border, that he completed for Howard Gilman, or the plans of which he completed for Howard Gilman. And it was a kit of parts, so 150 12-foot by 12-foot recombinable mobile cubes with off-the-shelf panels. And everything could be recombined. There were screens, there were catwalks, and the idea is that from this grid, you'd wander around and have experiences or combine them for whatever art and leisure experiences you might desire. It started with a number of plans, but then users could request what they wanted of Generator. And a couple of roles, Generator was the site. Barbara Jacobson was polarizer. It was her job to convince people to move the pieces around. And Factor was the plant organizer, or the site organizer, Wally Prince. Oops, sorry about that. So a couple shots from 2006 and from the basement here. These are qubits, little movable pieces. Again, the mobile crane, which you see continually in his work. And you know, the idea that you might do something like wander around with a blooper. I don't know, there was no date on this, but it's just an idea that you could wander and explore the grid based on something akin to a cell phone. But later in the project, he realized, I think, that getting people to move Generator's parts around might prove difficult. So he contacted John Fraser and started working with him on a set of ways to get people to do something different. So Fraser suggested to Price 4 different programs that would happen. Basically, all of the pieces of Generator would be outfitted with sensors, with little microcontrollers. And one program would keep track of all of the pieces and the inventory. One piece would provide a method for modeling. So what you see right here is these, what Fraser called intelligent beer maps. You could move them around and it would plot on the screen, it would plot the location of each Generator component. And then there was one other thing that Generator would do. If it wasn't moved around enough, it would get bored. And so it would run in what Fraser called a boredom program. And as he said, in the event of the site not being organized or changed for some time, the computer starts generating unsolicited plans and improvements. And in a handwritten postscript to Price, he wrote, if you kick a system, the very least that you would expect it to do is kick you back. You seem to imply that we were only useful if we produced results that you did not expect. I think this leads to some definition of computer aids in general. I'm thinking about this. But in the meantime, at least one thing you would expect from any half-decent program is that it should produce at least one plan that you did not expect. So I want to pause on that for a second because I think it represents one of it represents a discussion we had earlier in the week where we were talking about what happens with the 80,000 filaments that Peter Testa was talking about. That Greg Lynn laughed and said in the paperless studio they would have wanted to place every single one of those 80,000 filaments. And the idea of a generative architectural project is that you can't place 80,000. You wouldn't know where they'd end up. It's a question in at least one plan that you wouldn't expect would happen, or the system might kick you back. And with this, I will move on to the next architect, but I wanted to put this up here because I pulled a copy of Being Digital when I was here. Perhaps you have seen it. I know a couple of you have seen it. And as you probably know, we have, within the CCA, there are many of Cedric Price's own books. And this is his copy of Being Digital. And inside, he wrote, "Good, but dated." So maybe he did this after the fact, but I like his sentiment. All right, so Good but Dated. Nicholas Negroponte and the Architecture Machine Group. If we're looking again at architecture formatting, there's also a set of formatting to consider, and again, we've been talking about this throughout the weeks. What about funding? What about the social? What about, potentially in this case, the military? So it's important to note the institutional context of the Architecture Machine Group. It represents, I think, a strange moment in which it corresponds closely to what Paul Edwards calls the closed world, the flows of funding from the Department of Defense to private defense contractors to certain schools and back again, the same people wanting to continue to work together. And ArcMac was following the same strategies as many labs at MIT. So in his book, The Architecture Machine, which was published in 1970, Nicholas Negroponte dedicated the book to the first machine that can appreciate the gesture. I'll also point out that when you see pictures of Nicholas, his hands are always in the picture. There's always a gesture, and it's the operative performance of Nicholas himself. A little bit about him. So this is his first two books, Architecture Machine and Soft Architecture Machines. Both of them are here on the reserve shelf. He was born in 1942, so he's now about 71 years old. He was born into a very, very wealthy Greek shipping family. His brother is John Negroponte, who is a career diplomat and director of the National, I always mix this up, National Intelligence Association, but someone that you hear on the radio talking about Edward Snowden. A career diplomat and someone who has quite a bit of power. He was in Iraq as he went back to be an ambassador in Iraq in 2006. Negroponte studied at MIT, and his master's thesis was called "The Computer Simulation of Perception During Motion in Urban Environment." I just mention this because of two things. One, he was working with Stephen Koons. We've seen in a number of the lectures, we've seen pictures of Sketchpad. Stephen Koons oversaw the StepPad project once Ivan Sutherland left and went to the University of Utah. So it was Negroponte's interest to work with computers. That's why he went to do a master's in architecture. The other thing he wanted to do was define a field of research within architecture, and I think I've mentioned this in various comments, but he said in this 1966 thesis that as a profession, I quote, "We've done little research. All this work must take place within the academic world as we have no General Motors or NASA to sponsor philanthropic research. However, schools of architecture are still trade schools by nature and not compatible at this moment with the process of research." And so his approach to architectural research would be to take a room full of architects and a room full of engineers and put them together and have them collaborate in a process that I think looks less and less like architecture, but unlike some arguments, I think I argue that there are architectural logics under it, and he needs the broader focus of architecture in order to run either that or the media lab. Sort of looked like this. It looks like a geeky place with originally a lot of men, still a lot of men throughout. Michael Knoll wireframe drawings. These various elements here are the things that made up the actual architecture machine, which were a set of mini computers and software and hardware and peripherals that people could use. So in Architecture Machine, he talks about the Urban 5 model. This was his approach to, this was his software for designing a set of, again, 10 foot by 10 foot blocks and applying programmatic features to them. The other kind of key thing about this is he wanted this to change in its interaction with its users. He was hoping that it would become, he was using the notion of symbiosis, which was kind of the 1960s version of interactivity. That's effectively what it meant. It's a term that J.C.R. Licklider coined in about 1960. And so he thought that the machine would grow to be very flexible over time. So the way that this would work is the user would draw with the light pen on the screen, choose programmatic attributes here. These could be selected by different modes. This one here says panic. That's one of my favorites. So you can shift what it does. And then as you see, these are different screens to show actually what happened. And eventually what you see is many conflicts are occurring. Like many things, the Urban 5 really didn't work very well, and although he designed this in concert with students and in concert with the Architecture Machine Group co-director Leon Boisset, it was a lot of talk, and it wasn't really capable of doing very much. It was very similar to a lot of micro-worlds projects at that time, top-down control, limited environments, blocks worlds, as they were called. And in reality, they weren't really producing what the architects said they were, or what the designers said they were. On the other hand, I think this is sort of what prototyping is like. If we consider what someone like Klaus Oosterhuis said yesterday, you know, it works, I need to make it work, or I need to make some aspect of it work. Maybe there's something in that, between the demo ability and the it works, and what it works constitutes, that represents this move between design and prototyping and architecture. We've heard a little bit about software and about the set of things here. You'll notice mirrored blocks, an arm, and some gerbils in this pen. You can see maybe 3 gerbils, some wood chips. And I mentioned yesterday, I read a quick quote about our interfaces and our bodies being intimately connected to how we learn, and that they need to possess, that machines need to possess a body like ours. I think these projects, the next 2 projects I'm going to show are putting that into some strange relief. So what you see down here is a sign saying, or a little caption saying, gerbils match widths with computer-built environment. And here's the gerbil in the environment. Inside it says that seek metaphorically goes beyond the real world situation where machines cannot respond to the predictable nature of people or gerbils. So the gist of this was that the gerbils would do what gerbils do. They'd nudge around the blocks, they'd make homes, they'd run around, they'd fight with each other. And the machine would try to stack the blocks. It used computer visioning tools to see where the edges of blocks were. Again, blocks worlds, tools that were developed by MIT's AI lab in concert with the Architecture Machine Group. And then it would run one of 6 programs and try to organize the tools. The whole project is essentially about the disconnect. The catalog says, today's machines are poor at handling sudden changes in context and environment. The lack of ability is the problem that Seek confronts in diminutive. So you see again these various versions of blocks and gerbils, and maybe it's an apologia. The project was a tremendous failure, and one reason might be pretty apparent, that Seek tended to kill the gerbils. Another project that Negroponte includes in Architecture Machine is called Interact, and it's by an undergraduate actually named Richard Hesdorfer. What Richard Hesdorfer did was take a number of South End Boston residents and put them in front of a computer and have them interact and ask them about questions of urban existence. You know, how do you feel about your housing? How do you feel about your tenants, schools, etc.? And he writes that first, the three residents had no qualms about talking with the computer in English about personal desires. They did not type uncalled for comments. They said things they probably never would have said to another human, particularly a white planner or a politician. Then the machine was not black, was not white, and surely had no prejudices. But of course, in the kind of prototyping and hand-waving methods of the architecture machine group and later the MIT Media Lab, the reader should know that as these various users did not, that actually they were interacting with a white man at the other end of a telephone line. And then they quickly say, don't worry, you know, in the future we will be repeating this experiment. It's difficult to see with the quality of the image, but what his button says is tenant power. So I think it raises interesting questions about the position of a user in some of these different systems and possibly what happens in these spatialized informational experiences. I'm not sure that Negroponte or the architecture machine group people gave much consideration to some of the political issues that were going on the outside and in the outside world. In the 1970s, ArcMac moved into a different set of projects, a number of them taking place in this media room. This media room was about the size of the front part of the room here, with a large light valve screen in front, 2 touch screens on the side, cameras, screens, and it was a place where they wanted to start envisioning what they were going to call supreme usability. They start referring to computing as something like a place or a milieu, that it's a state of mind, and that a state of mind is a comfortable place to be with computers. So a couple of elements about that comfortable place. In the middle of that room is an Eames chair, and here it is in the architecture machine group in their newsletter. It was an Eames chair that they retrofitted with joysticks and later touchpads. And so, as you sat in the chair, as you can see, Nicholas Negroponte is with the optional touchscreen, or with the tablet on his lap. You can see where he might be doing this. It's a little bit different than something like the keyboard and the barber chair in the architecture machine. But here's one way that this would work. One of the best known projects used in the media room is the Aspen movie map. So this is, the user would sit in the Eames chair. This is about 1978 to 1980. You'd sit in the Eames chair, you'd zoom forward and backward. On one side you'd have a street map, on the other side you'd have images from top down of the satellite map. These images would be delivered by video disc. I think it looks rather like certain technologies we use now, but a little less spatialized. Moreover, it was the basis of a lot of dissertations in which students investigated movies that would happen as you go in and interact with people as you drive through Aspen, Colorado, which is what this is. The room was used for other things that I want to point out. The spatial data management system was a system that was developed for fleet management in ships and this is again for the Department of Defense. And what you see here is an opportunity to zoom through satellite maps. You could also, using touchscreens, you touch into icons. So they were trying to figure out the navigation of information interfaces. Again, as a key to something spatial and as spatialized information. So they're not the only people at this time, they don't get full credit, but they're one party that is working on issues issues that basically become desktop computing models that we're familiar with today. Again, from a spatial perspective, these are Landsat images that a user could zoom into and then finally get to eventually a large set of Boston landmarks. There were also a set of architectural slides that had been put into onto video disc and could be surfed in that same kind of manner. The body becomes important here. So within this space with cameras, and once you're out of sitting in the chair or potentially standing up, you could begin to point to things and use voice and gesture to interact. And so this is a project called Put That There. I decided not to include the video link. It's a little bit too long. But what a user does is says, pay attention, and the system says, okay. And then the user says, make a pink circle. And it says, where? And you say, there. And then it makes the circle. And there's some manner, it models some manner of abstraction. So you can say, put the yellow circle there. Put that there. And here you see circles, but everything else, all the videos are ship fleets. And so again, it's clear what kind of context it's in. The reason that these military contexts are necessary at this point in time is because command and the explicit military nature of them is that for defense funding, basic military research, just general explorational military research could not be done. And so instead what you needed to do is you needed to explicitly tie it to a military context. So we'll see that. But with the put that there, I'm reminded also of Ted Nelson, who is the father of hypertext, and his book, Dream Machines, with this Superman flying through the air and a cigarette and Levi's and a cape. And he wrote that responsive computer display systems can, should, and will restructure and light up the mental life of mankind. You start seeing other things like this. This is a proposal for mapping by yourself, which was a project that they worked on, again, in this late 70s time period. And they start talking about the computer creating a reality that is indistinguishable from the real thing. I'm quoting them, and in the introduction to this report, they say we are reminded of the prompt from Bell. It is the next best thing to being there. This proposal is about being there. So what they begin to imagine is that this is not a substitution. It's not virtual. It is the thing. They also show things like this. This is 1978, and it is a Westinghouse 12-inch by 12-inch screen that was to be used for mapping. It's basically an early proposal for augmented reality and transparent maps with haptic feedback where you could run your fingers over it and get terrain below, get a feel of the terrain below, and maps with sonic feedback. Again, there's always a question of what was actually realized, but they did carry on this project into the 1990s and at the architecture, or at the MIT Media Lab. They did, of course, consider some interesting form factors like the Star Wars, the Scandinavian, and the military chic model. But it's different kinds of ways to think through where we ended up today. I don't mean to be technologically deterministic. I don't think I am, but I think these are ideas that eventually would have come to bear at some point. I think eventually military models stop being where the architecture machine group was, and so instead they end up moving toward media. And as we know, this is a way of addressing convergence, and convergence is kind of the burning thing that starts to happen in 1983 with Ithiel de Solarpool's with his notion of it. So these get called Negroponte's teething rings, broadcasting, publication, and computers, and using these three things together to push ahead and start forming the Media Lab. The Media Lab, they earned $40 million, and they raised $40 million from 40 different companies, and they start the Media Lab in 1984 with 10 different groups, and the architecture machine group folds into those 10 different groups. The groups that fund them are from automotive, broadcasting, movie studios, newspaper, information companies, toys, big chunk of money from Japan, still 10% from DARPA, and a smattering of money from the NSF. And the advantage is, of course, you can use this as a place to develop media, and this is a good place. This is where your research budget should go. So ultimately, the building was to be its own medium, as they described it in this article. This is the IMP building that they envisioned, and it's not Pei's best building. The whole building is actually a little uncomfortable. IMP.
Why is it going to develop it?
Why is this? This is I don't know why. But this is a memo that he sent about the building being a medium at that point in time. So I've moved quickly through the media aspect, but basically the Media Lab opens in 1985, and it's still the only lab at MIT that can grant a degree. It still maintains its connection with the architecture, within the School of Architecture, and yet its output looks really quite different, and culturally there's not necessarily a lot of crossover. I think that the effect is in changing the notion of research. The architecture school counted it as part of its research budget until 1990. I'm going to jump ahead. I want to show where some of these logics show up. Negroponte founded one laptop per child, which is the idea of a rugged, low-cost laptop that puts, with the goal of putting a laptop in the hands of every child in every developing country. And so they refer to it as deployments. When one laptop per child deploys an XO1 laptop, they try to get it everywhere. So Peru, 860,000 of them, Uruguay, 470,000, and they're in over 30 countries. But there are some interesting logics that get brought together here. Negroponte gave a talk, a TED Talk, in 2008. And then another one in 2010 in the field. And I just want to show a couple minutes of what this deployment actually looks like. I'll preface it by saying that in lectures, he's realized that he used to only talk to heads of companies when he was fundraising for the Media Lab. And with one laptop per child, he would only talk to the heads of state. But then he said he realized he needed to be talking to the defense ministers because they're the ones who are around. They're the ones with longevity when the heads of state are out in a couple of years.
With the Minister of Defense of Colombia, the head of the Army, and the head of the police. And we're dropping off 650 laptops today to children who have no television, no telephone, and have been in a community cut off from the rest of the world for the past 40 years. The importance of delivering laptops to this region is connecting kids who have otherwise been unconnected because of the FARC, the guerrillas that started off 40 years ago as a political movement and then became a drug movement. There are 1 billion children in the world, and 50% of them don't have electricity at home or at school. And in some countries, let me pick Afghanistan, 75% of the little girls don't go to school. I don't mean that they drop out of school in the 3rd or 4th grade, they don't go. So in the 3 years since I talked at TED and showed a prototype, it's gone from an idea to a real laptop. We have 500,000 laptops today in the hands of children. We have about 250,000 in transit to those and other children. And then there are another 250,000 and more that are being ordered at this moment. So in rough numbers, there are 1 million laptops. That's smaller than I predicted. I predicted 3 to 10 million, but it is still a very large number. In Colombia, we have about 3,000 laptops. It's the Minister of Defense with whom we're working, not the Minister of Education, because it is seen as a strategic defense issue in the sense of liberating these zones that had been completely closed off, in which the people who had been causing, if you will, 40 years worth of bombings and kidnappings and assassinations live. And suddenly, the kids have connected laptops. They've leapfrogged. The change is absolutely monumental because it's not just open.
I'll stop on Negroponte there, but I think it raises some interesting questions. And the latest thing is that they're deploying the new tablet laptops out of a plane. He announced this in 2011, and he said we will literally take tablets and drop them out of helicopters. The reporters asked him, "Are you serious?" And he said, "When I say no people, I mean absolutely no people. When I say drop out of the helicopters, I mean it. It's like a Coke bottle falling out of the sky," in reference to the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. So I think it brings to mind the notion, we talked or skirted around Virilio, but the quote that Virilio makes about logistics being the procedure with which a nation's potential is transferred to its armed forces in times of peace and times of war. It's an interesting view of education and educational deployment. So, 5 things: formatting architectural problems, visualizing information paradigms in architecture, generating solutions, architecture as a mediating process, and finally spatializing data. So in looking at this archaeology of information and architecture, it's a different set of ways of looking at these things. They don't have the surface finishes and some of the sex appeal, I think, of some of Greg Lynn's and some of the 1980s work, but they do present other modes of architectural information and architectural formatting. I want to ask a couple of things, like where do we go from here? And if I could just shift gears and wind up sort of more in this sense on a seminar basis, I want to throw a couple of ideas out there. One is that I don't think that you can separate the virtual and the real, or the virtual and the actual. There's something that, there is no offline anymore, and there is no online anymore, and there isn't going to be. I have this nice idea that when I go on vacation next week, I'm going to go offline. That's probably not going to happen, but even if it did, they're not separable anymore. I put up here these 3 books to look at maybe other directions we might want to look at going forward. There are some things that came up in conversation this week. So Howard Reinhold wrote the book Virtual Community in 1993. He was the editor-in-chief of the Millennium Whole Earth Catalog. And then, of course, there's the whole Stewart brand set of relationships. I think that's something else that we might look at. We didn't really dig into in too much detail here, looking at prefigurings of the digital. And I think this challenges the idea of online or offline. There are things like new aesthetics, and this is just a Google search on the phrase new aesthetic, and this is what came up. But Matthew Battles, James Bridle coined and started using the term. He's a British designer, and Matthew Battles came up with, I think, a pretty good definition of what it is. The new aesthetic is a collaborative attempt, to draw a circle around several species of aesthetic activity, including but not limited to drone photography, ubiquitous surveillance, glitch imagery, street view photography, 8-bit net nostalgia. Central to the new aesthetic is a sense that we're learning to wave at machines, and that perhaps in their glitchy, buzzy, algorithmic ways, they're beginning to wave back in earnest. So that might be one set of directions we might go in trying to locate architecture and locate information. We've talked a little bit about the processing language, and one of the things I think that's useful about it is that built into it is learning and education. It's a part of its system. Let's see. So while it can also present something beautiful or algorithmic, it can also teach somebody how to draw online, and it is developed especially for designers to learn. So this is a simple machine that Casey Reese designed, the processing founder, and it uses a set number of behaviors, forms, and elements, as he calls it. We've talked a little bit about the Arduino. This is another, this actually came out of the school where I was a professor, and is physical computing and makes it possible to put interactivity into things. It's fairly easy to learn. It uses a language related to processing and is very straightforward to learn and get running. One thing people here have asked me to mention, I think in various ways, is things like smart mobs and flash mobs. This is actually, I got captured many years ago in a flash mob picture in the SF Chronicle, right when people were throwing them. And while this is a fun thing to do in Dolores Park in San Francisco, you can't discount the effect of a mobile phone on something like this. I'll fully admit that I took these images from Wikipedia because it seemed appropriate, and they were some of the best images for Arab Spring and the uprisings. And these were, again, largely coordinated through social media, through social networks, and through mobile technology. There are other things that architects seem to be less involved in, but as we're less involved in them, the urban scene around us is interested. So this is urban prototyping, as it's called, and it is a set of projects going on nationwide in the United States. These ones are organized by GAFTA, the Gray Area Foundation for the Arts in San Francisco. Britt was mentioning Code for America the other day, which does various civic initiatives working with local governments to develop apps that change how people engage. Jennifer Palka, who's the executive director of Code for America, has just become Deputy Chief Technology Officer for government innovation in the Obama administration. But I also want to suggest that sometimes these technologies affect our streets in different kinds of ways. People organized in San Francisco and started developing parklets, in part because of access to social media, and in part because they wanted to be more mobile, and their lifestyles allowed them to be outside and mobile more frequently. You begin to see things like The Wiggle, a neighborhood that really didn't have an identity, but again, thanks to bicycles, young people, and social media, they've organized and developed street signs and an entire neighborhood that didn't really kind of exist before. It's called The Wiggle because of a way that you bike through San Francisco in order to avoid hills. So I guess in closing, what I'd like to suggest is that it doesn't need to look like this. If you Google data and cities, you get these ridiculous landscapes. You know, I'm reminded of an article that Andreas sent me talking about the future. This Microsoft research keynote that was given yesterday that said the future will be analog, because as these technologies sink into the world around us and as we navigate them as usual, it's not a city of bits that's modeled in ones and zeros. It's a city that looks quite like the way we do. I think it's one where the online is not offline, and where we're seeing these formatting problems as looking explicitly or increasingly and normally architectural and not quite so technological. I think there's fertile ground for architects, for historians, for theorists to get in there. Other people are doing it for us. So it would be, I wanted to end here and show a couple ways that maybe we could engage. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Very simple question, but I was intrigued by the fact that, what you say about liberal politics, that it's still very architectural, etc. So, as a kind of provocation, what do you see as architecture that the media it's not completely a provocation, it's a question I'm asking myself.
Yeah. I can't speak on the basis of projects, but just speaking
about your own impression.
On the structural basis, they maintain the connection because they need to maintain the connection, I think, in order to grant degrees, for one.
Okay.
And I guess I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't know the answer to that question quite yet. Nor do I know what Joey Ito, the current director, has in store for how he wants to change it. Just that one of the first people he's put in place is Kevin Slavin, who's been looking at kind of these crossovers between urban space without being an architect, flirting with architecture. But on the basis of current projects, I don't know. What's your impression?
I don't know either. Clearly, some of the obsession was a sensory interface to have a certain relation, but actually more very often to German than the classical architecture. And I'm still struck by how far it is. Actually, as you say, the school of architecture is a convenient umbrella for a number of institutional reasons. It's not totally clear for me. So I was just asking.
I go.
Well, I never thought it was very have some one of your films. I got it, and he also got it for sound. So for them, but then they started using discs to record readings or whatever.
I don't know. I don't know about that part of the history. I know about the video discs used for the set of projects that I've been looking
That's
at.
what I was wondering about, is that these things all coincidence?
I think if Axel Killian is right, I haven't actually viewed the discs themselves, but if Axel Killian is right, there is some place at MIT where there is a room full of stuff. And it's not, no doubt, exactly. So I know, the MIT archives has the paper material.
I just wondered,
But
not so much as, did it move it into something? Did it move into visual, like investigations, visually?
I don't know if I understand your question, the second part of your question.
Well, I guess it's the whole disc thing.
Right.
And you can program that, forever. And you don't know whether that happened.
Well, they did it, the video discs were a central part of their research, so, and video disc technology, from getting an early video disc player, a prototype from Matasuya. I guess when did they get it? Late 70s, early 80s, late 70s. And so they did keep working with it. There was the set of things, there were the set of projects around storage and image storage. There were a set of projects around different display technologies within the architecture machine group, so rather large display, a lot of projects around touch displays. And so this was a matter of connecting the two. So I haven't delved into the long history of the video disc, but it would be something that would be, I think, legible somewhat also in the Architecture Machinations newsletters. Yeah.
And another question for you, more fundamental. I was really struck by your take on information, and it really contrasts a lot to kind of obsession currently about code writing. When architects usually speak about their relation, the need to go really to the real thing in the digital. It's actually not data that comes, information. It's code writing. So what kind of difference? How do we react to this kind of difference between?
One of the things I nearly included, but couldn't find suitable. Well, I could find many suitable images and just didn't choose one. Was with data visualization, which is another direction I think that there's just kind of the general art, technology, architectural design obsession with data visualization, which does require you to go to the code and tweak the code and see what you're getting. It's a different parameterized view, I think. But in this sense, what I've been interested in this research is how the architects were formatting information in these various processes. So that's why I spent the time on why Alexander was worth spending the time, although I look forward to not having to spend that much time with him anymore. I think it's dramatic dramatic or traumatic. No, it's still fascinating in a lot of ways. I think he probably was, to a certain extent, tweaking code in order to get the formats to work, and in order to get things to fit his model of the world. Andreas?
In the past days, we've encapsulated the narrative of the digital in the base of some sort of anticipation, especially related to the show. There was a day where digital wasn't there, but we were thinking of it. And then the machine came, and suddenly we could realize what we dreamed of. And instead, in the presentation, in the lecture that you gave today, I was wondering how that narrative of anticipation fits into the stories. Whether that's actually the case, or whether your archaeologists of the digital somehow oppose a different logic to the narrative of the digital, rather than anticipation, maybe something else.
Right. The ways in which they, let me make sure I understand the question, the ways that the three individuals were anticipating the digital,
or in their work. I mean, take for instance the way in which Lynn talked about the way in which he looked at the abilities that the machine brought in. For instance, at the beginning, he was trying to the pain of reproducing the project in Chicago manually, which then, of course, through the machine, that didn't occur. So it's some sort of an anticipation narrative. And I was wondering whether the anticipation within a kind of biographical setting of just one of these figures could be a way to, either confirm the way in which the digital has been narrated in the last 2 weeks, or it's,
okay.
yeah.
There's, Negroponte says he thought that architecture school was a good way to do things with computers. Remember, he graduated from undergraduate in 1965, so he was quite young, early at that point. And then, immediately upon finishing his master's degree, started teaching in lieu of Stephen Coons. So he started actually teaching computers in mechanical engineering right off the bat. So he anticipated computers and wanted his hands on them. So did Alexander. In fact, he structured his various projects so that a computer would be required in the early days to calculate things because he wanted to play with them. But then something interesting happens. Around the time that some of the figures that we've been looking at in the last 2 weeks, around the time that these people start getting access to computers, Alexander stops using it. Or stops, he gets rid of it altogether, and he interpolates the logic of the computer into the pattern language. So it functions like a program, only there's no computer that you're typing at. There's no computer present. And Price is a different kind of figure because in that anticipation, it's a visualization in architecture or in architectural projects of information processes or of computational processes, not computation in the sense that you follow these certain procedures and these things happen, but he depicts an entire information network as the information hub of Oxford Corner House, or it's the anticipation of distributed intelligence is what he models in Generator. So again, he himself was not a computer user. And I think his fax machine, from what I've heard, usually didn't even work. So, but the logic of it is there. And maybe that's part of what underlies this. There's a really strange logic in one laptop per child, apparently. When you look at it, it isn't about education. It's about deployment. Yeah, I think that those are some ways that you see it tie together in some different ways.
I'm coming back to my question again about all that visual stuff that was happening at MIT at that time, because they were lucky at that moment when Rose was happening, where I talked about one aspect of the architectural investigation. He was doing these great projects where you could walk into any room, any place, any building. It was a real sort of army horror, like that. But he was really working on that. And so he was really working with the world, sort of evolved down a little early. But all the stuff is pretty unique on stuff with the sound. But we all have our own little tiny handcuffs. But didn't he take this any further? This kind of investigation of moving into space that you could be part of the city that way.
Yeah. So one of the things that he repeats a lot in his own personal narrative is the idea of a memory palace. Simonides, exactly. So it's Simonides, when he would try to memorize a speech, would walk through a temple. And when he,
Classical rhetoric.
exactly,
Most rhetoric pleases
yes,
the temple of memory.
yes, exactly. So Negroponte's idea, in Negroponte's own rhetoric, he notes that and notes the classical technique of doing it, and then says that's what you're using that's what you're doing when you're navigating information on a screen. But then the media room starts providing these spaces within which you could locate information. It's not an actual physical thing, but you're using the same mental processes. It isn't so much Negroponte who goes on to work with that, but it's people like Walter Bender. It's people like, I'm going to have one of these moments where I've just gone through, I'm not going to come up with the exact names, but a number of people at MIT in the architecture machine group did take on and continue to work with these surrounds and with things that you could interact with both gesturally and through voice and through visual cues and through
Well,
gesture.
it just seems to me amazing that the journey studies was,
Yeah. I see where you're going. And it didn't, except to the extent that something like Aspen Movie Map was a study of the city, and the interest in Aspen Movie Map was as a way, it's a battleground situation. If you've got a simulation of a city that you can zoom through, yeah, from a safe distance, it's very attractive.
but it could also start to change the formation of the forest. This is what you've already said, nobody's done it much.
No, it's true, they haven't, and that's, that it strikes me that it's another area to consider, another area that could use research, and I've only just kind of jotted this down, but things like, obviously the development of virtual reality, and then starting in about 1994, 95, the virtual reality markup language, that would also use SGI machines because that's what you need to model it, and then being able to fly through space, at least on a screen, and interact in some way, as though the forms that you were seeing could be hyperlinked to the way that computer text is, the way that hypertext is.
I was using fly-throughs in my school.
Yeah, well, fly-throughs, Negroponte's master's thesis was about fly-throughs and using animation, except at that point in time, you'd need to generate an image on a computer screen, photograph, generate the next one, and you'd have to create the animation. So you could build it, but it was part of what he was looking at. He also worked with Kepish on it, so he counted Kepish as a close friend. Has everybody melted?
You created a new genealogy for this course, but at the very end, you will define problems or issues that are not very different, for example, from the one that Tschumi has raised after his critical rethinking and a hidden disappointment for the paperless generation studio. So how this genealogy that you created is shaping the questions or the issues in a different way than the way that the one of Bernard. So what is different in the urban that you raise as an issue than the one that Bernard is raising as an issue, coming from another kind of genealogy, for example, or the aesthetic? What is different?
I think one of the things I wanted to raise, he raised questions and said, these things are not being done. And I think in brackets were by traditional architects. One thing I wanted to raise is that there are people working on a lot of these issues. They're being taken on by affiliated or circular fields, not in schools of architecture and not in schools of, or not in urban design or planning programs. So they are taken on by 20-something, 30-something computer programmers on weekend by designers who want to take on things at a bigger scale, or by rooftop conferences or private mailing lists or social networks. And it's just outside of the bound of architecture offices or architectural communities. And I have a number of reasons why I guess that's the case. One is, simply it hasn't been going on it's been a fringe thing in architecture schools. Perhaps it's an issue of accreditation, expertise, and some of these other schools are just better, or situations are better equipped to deploy the technology, or deploy these technologies in these ways. And I just used the D word, which is interesting. I shouldn't have used deploy. But they can engage with some of these things more easily because that's where those skills lie. So that's one thing. I don't know necessarily that it is a new world, just that we have other ways to navigate it faster or differently. I guess there's one word that I specifically, or one phrase I specifically did not use, which was big data. Big data is, I was talking to someone who studies scientists who work on big data, and he said they define it as follows. Big data is any data set that is bigger than you have the capability of analyzing. So if you can, if all the data that you can do is this big or is in a notebook, then big data is going to be 10 notebooks. If for me it's what is in my computer, it's going to be a server. But for someone who's really working on data issues, it's for really, really big things, and data sets far bigger than they've got at hand right now. Not a very precise definition for this thing that's such a buzzword. So, and I think there's also the specter of Edward Snowden and surveillance that we know is going on, and what we've learned about not necessarily the objects themselves or the people themselves, but what is gleaned through metadata. So, maybe there are questions here. Maybe there's a question of what the poche is in this setting, or what the urban poche is when we can be defined by the location ID of our telephone calls, if not the content of that call, the things that you can learn through those relations and connections. So I put that out there, but maybe the world is not 180 degrees different. Maybe it's just more microscopic.
Your suggestion may be that the world might be larger than architecture.
I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't dare.
But it's going there.
Of course the world is larger than architecture.
I always get this impression.
This is a question that gets me in trouble in architecture school. I guess.
Because it raises this question by the end, because what we have is by the end, most of the others is a very architectural history within architectural debate of the use of the computer, which stem, from reconstruction, etc. And what you're arguing is that actually there are a lot of things going on the relation between information and space that doesn't go through this channel, which seems like a perfectly reasonable proposition, and which could be translated as the world is larger than architecture.
Well, architecture has an opportunity to take back the world. But yeah, I think there are possibilities there. If you look at the whole, has anyone been familiar with the new aesthetic and the debate that went on last year about it? Yeah, it was a very big thing for a very small group of people, as some of these things are. And basically, the gist of it is James Bridle. I'll put up the slide with that.
Now check, you get these images.
I did. I totally got it. I did a screenshot and just put up the screenshot because it seemed appropriate to do that. If I was going to deal with new aesthetic, then I should use the
because Google reads your references and
I got the same.
Is the Google personalized answer
And it's
to
a
your
U-loop.
history track?
Yeah, this is my U-loop of new aesthetic. But James Bridle started a Tumblr, I guess, in 2011, just trying to keep track of the different images he saw that like such a digital thing to do, or digitally thinking thing to do. You start a Tumblr to categorize what you've got and put it out there. And other people started contributing to it. And he and Matt Jones, Dan Hill, a number of British designers, the guys who run Berg, sort of peripherally connected to the Royal College of Art. A couple of them were trained as architects but don't work as them. They started this broader discussion around the new aesthetic, and at the South by Southwest Interactive Conference in 2012, they had a panel about the new aesthetic. Bruce Sterling, who's a science fiction writer, attended the panel, and there was good discussion. It was a friendly discussion. There were some very large balloons in the room that almost had a foam model of a drone, and Joanne McNeil attempted a kind of history of new aesthetic and images that preceded images such as this, looking back to futurism, etc. And then Bruce Sterling wrote an article that absolutely slammed this in Wired, like a 5,000-word article, and just you're nodding, so I think you've read it, and just slayed that. I mean, it was really pretty impressive. Bruce Sterling has always had a friendly relationship with this group of people, and so it was an atom bomb dropping. And then there were questions: what are we going to do? What does this mean? I participated in a new aesthetic death match. I feel like Stan Allen when I say I don't have a dog in this fight, because I don't. But I thought that it was interesting that a group of people who are more coincidentally working in digital art and digital urban issues started trying to theorize what they were seeing. Basically, it's postmodernism. And I think the way that they're theorizing it could have been theorized by any number of things that have been written in the 80s and 90s. But I still think that there might be something going on here where there are communities of people trying to explain what it is they're seeing, and they don't have access to the history of the paperless studio, or they're not aware of these archaeologies of the digital. They're aware of what's on the internet, and that's how they get there, and that's what they display. So anyway, I'm not sure exactly where to go with that, but maybe this is something else that happens, that it is collaborative, that it is seeking, that it starts and ends with digital media. It doesn't necessarily try to get to paper, although I should mention he's an editor and makes books as a way of thinking through things, so he does actually use paper. Anyway, more open questions perhaps there too.
What did you think of what Bruce wrote?
I thought it was all over the place, but I also think that the new aesthetic was largely developed by a group of lads, and that it was a pretty self-circumscribed little moment. A group of lads that are my good friends, but still, yeah. Shall we?
Perhaps if I take advantage of the last moment of silence, I ask you another thing.
Absolutely.
Why art and aesthetic theory are never part of this discussion? You have art, because art has been very important in the development of this mediatization and the virtual and theory and why it's not part of the discussion. And I'm asking you because there is kind of, especially certain younger generation artists, a kind of distance from that and a kind of call, not to generalize, but really return to the real, specific, to the certain kind of traditional materialization. So I thought that this idea of embracing different disciplines, what has always surprised me is that the wider architecture in the past has sometimes taken advantage of the art collaboration theoretically. In this case, there is a kind of a closed door, and all this kind of thinking that I think would be interesting. pluralizing partners as being totally, how can I say, on another floor, no door of protection. It's just an observation, because you have been so generous in opening, trying to open the kind of, imagine if you have some comments on that.
I think that it is that there are points of connection. I mean, if we walk backward from where we are today, contemporary digital and some of the issues of digital archaeology, looking at the work of Rhizome is important. Considering somebody like Ben Fino-Raden is doing digital archives at MoMA. There are things like remediation, the book remediation that figures into some of my work and into some of the more theoretical stuff. Although I tend to work more toward media theory in my theorization. But it doesn't mean that there aren't communities, and I think that some of the places that theory and practice are crossing over are festivals such as the IO Festival in Minneapolis, EYEOfestival.com, which is data visualization, but art and technology and design kind of in the same community. Looking back further, we've talked a little bit about the connections of digital art, and I didn't go into any detail here, but there's obviously a very strong set of connections. And if you're looking at the history of something like processing, that's coming out of procedural art and digital art, as well as John Maeda era Media Lab. There are other people, I think, in this room who are art historians who probably would add more and better things to this list. I know that Rolf, who is here, is turning to some of those works. I know Alexis Cohen is working on a different era, but certainly is versed. And I don't know, maybe in closing, if I am closing, I don't know that I am, but it would be great to be able to develop some of these bibliographies that cross over, because there are so many different, we all have micro-canons for what we're doing and putting together when we're working on these issues. And there are a lot of works that should be drawn on and drawn together, that the people in this room have the ability to make a start for. So I'd like to suggest that actually that's something we do. That's something we try to
So
do.
we assign that each of them has to fulfill for Monday morning.
Yeah, that's true.
Phyllis.
May I thank you for your great contribution for these, 10 days? It's been terrific. Thank you very, very much. You managed it well, and you also, your record today, brought along the content, and so
Thank you.
always,
Thank you very, very much.
thank you.